Right now, if a weird rash showed up on your arm, you'd do one of two things: Google it or call your doctor. Either way, in about 10 seconds, you'd have a name for what's happening to your body. 4,000 years ago, that same rash meant something completely different. It didn't mean an infection, it meant a god had reached down and touched you, and somewhere, on a piece of wet clay, someone pressed a reed stylus into the mud and wrote down what that touch looked like, what it did to the skin, how long it lasted, whether the person lived or died. That clay tablet is, as far as we can prove, the first time a human being ever sat down and documented a disease, not prayed about it, not blamed it on a curse and moved on. Documented it like a doctor's chart 4,000 years before the word doctor existed. Today we're digging up that record, literally, and what's written on it is stranger and honestly more advanced than you'd expect. To understand how strange this is, you have to picture a world with no concept of germs, no concept of infection, no microscopes, obviously, but also no idea that something invisible could even cause illness in the first place. If you got sick in ancient Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, around 2000 BC, there was no biological explanation available to you. None. The most educated person in your city could not have told you that bacteria existed because nobody would understand that idea for another 3,700 years. So what filled that gap? Gods, ghosts, demons, curses. Every illness had to come from somewhere, and if it wasn't visible, it had to be supernatural. A fever wasn't a fever. It was a specific spirit with a specific name who had a habit of grabbing specific parts of the body. Here's the wild part, though. Even inside that supernatural framework, ancient physicians were doing something remarkably close to real medicine. They were watching patients, taking notes, comparing cases, building patterns. They just filed all of it under religion instead of biology. And that's exactly the mindset you need to hold on to for the rest of this video, because the first disease ever formally recorded wasn't written down by a scientist. It was written down by a priest. Let's start with the actual oldest surviving medical text in human history. Not a disease description yet, just medicine, period. It's a small clay tablet found in the ruins of the city of Nippur in modern Iraq, and it dates back to around 2100 BC. That's roughly 4,100 years old. For context, that's older than the pyramids at Giza were when Cleopatra was alive. This tablet isn't dramatic. It doesn't read like a diagnosis. It reads more like a recipe box. It lists ingredients, things like milk, turtle shell, plant resins, river mud, ground up and mixed into treatments. No god is blamed. No disease is even named. It's just, here's a problem. Here's what we put on it. Historians think this tablet might actually represent an older, more practical layer of Sumerian medicine, one that existed before the religious explanations took over completely, but it doesn't tell us what disease it's treating. It just tells us what to do about it. For an actual, named, described, documented disease, something closer to what we'd call a real medical record, we have to go about 900 years further forward in time to one of the most impressive intellectual achievements of the ancient world. It's called the Diagnostic Handbook, and the man who wrote it may be the first named physician in human history. His name was Esagil-kin-apli. He lived in the city of Borsippa in Babylon, somewhere around 1067 BC, and what he built was staggering in scale. The Diagnostic Handbook, sometimes called the Sakiku, is a systematic head-to-toe catalog of human illness. 40 tablets, around 3,000 entries, organized methodically, starting with symptoms observed in a patient's head and working all the way down to their feet. Think about that structure for a second. That's not superstition scribbled in a panic. That's an organizational system. That's someone trying to build order out of chaos. The exact instinct that still drives modern medical textbooks today. For each set of symptoms, Esagil-kin-apli recorded 3 things: what the patient looked like, what god or spirit was believed to be responsible, and what the likely outcome would be: recovery or death. And here's where it gets specific enough to matter for our story. Buried inside that catalog is a disease described with enough detail, consistency, and clinical precision that modern doctors reading the tablets today can recognize exactly what it is. The ancient name for it was Bennu. We call it epilepsy. The description of Bennu in the Diagnostic Handbook is honestly kind of eerie to read. because it lines up so closely with what we know today. The tablets describe a patient whose neck turns to the left, whose hands and feet go rigid, whose eyes stare fixed to one side, who loses consciousness, and who, crucially, has no memory of what happened afterward. That's not a vague description of bad spirits. That's a symptom-by-symptom account of what we now call a tonic-clonic seizure. The Babylonians attributed different types of seizures to different gods and demons depending on which direction the patient's head turned or which limb moved first. One variation was blamed on the moon god Sin, another on a demon called Idta. It sounds mystical on the surface, but functionally, they were doing something doctors still do constantly, subclassifying a condition based on its presentation. They weren't right about why it happened, but they were remarkably right about what was happening, and this matters because it means epilepsy has a real claim to being the very first disease in human history to be systematically named, clinically described, tracked for outcome, and recorded for future physicians to reference. Not guessed at, not mentioned once in passing, actually documented as a defined medical entity with enough consistency that we can still diagnose it from the writing alone 3,000 years later. That's the first disease with a file. Now, Mesopotamia isn't the only place making a claim here. Ancient Egypt has its own contender, and it comes with something Mesopotamia doesn't have: actual physical evidence. The Ebers Papyrus, dating to around 1550 BC, is one of the most detailed medical documents to survive from the ancient world. It describes tumors, contains what may be one of the earliest descriptions of symptoms resembling diabetes, and lists hundreds of remedies for conditions across the entire body. But Egypt also gives us something Mesopotamia can't: a body. The mummy of Pharaoh Ramesses V, who died around 1157 BC, shows raised, pustule-like scarring across the face, a pattern many researchers have linked to smallpox. If that identification holds up, it's one of the oldest physical specimens of a named disease ever preserved. Not a description of it, the actual disease frozen in tissue for over 3,000 years. So depending on how you define first written description, or first physical evidence, you get two different ancient superpowers pointing to two different diseases: Mesopotamia's epilepsy, methodically cataloged in ink and clay, and Egypt's smallpox, preserved in the skin of a king. Here's the part that actually reframes this whole story: the instinct to observe, record, categorize, and predict outcome. That instinct didn't start with modern medical science. It started thousands of years ago in a temple with a priest staring at a patient and trying to make sense of something invisible using the only intellectual tools available to him. He got the cause wrong, completely wrong. There was no god reaching down. There was no demon named Idta, but the process he used, watch closely, write it down, compare it to other cases, predict what happens next. That process is the actual seed of everything modern medicine is built on. Diagnosis, prognosis, case history. Those aren't new ideas. They're 4,000 years old, wearing a lab coat instead of priestly robes, and there's something oddly comforting in that. Long before anyone understood what disease actually was, humans were already doing the one thing that makes medicine work in the first place: paying close attention to each other and refusing to just shrug and call it fate. So the next time you feel a symptom and instinctively reach for your phone to search it, you're doing something a Babylonian physician would recognize immediately. You're pattern matching. You're trying to name the thing that's happening to you so you can predict what comes next. The tools have changed almost beyond recognition. The instinct hasn't changed at all. 4,000 years ago, someone pressed a reed into wet clay and wrote down the first disease anyone ever thought to record. They called it the touch of a god. We call it epilepsy. Either way, it was the beginning of something that never stopped, the very human refusal to let suffering go unexplained. If this changed the way you think about where medicine actually began, hit like, drop a comment with what surprised you most, and subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of forgotten history we dig into every week.